Okay. So I forgot. I have to introduce, I have the pleasure of introducing Robin Andersen, who is the Associate Professor of Communication and Media Studies and the Director of the Peace and Justice Studies program at Fordham University. She's also an author. Where's your book?
It's upstairs.
Okay, she's got her book for sale upstairs. She'll tell you about it. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark talked about 8 days of the war in Iraq, and I tried to look at the war in Iraq over the course of a century. The name of my book is called A Century of Media, A Century of War. And I learned from trying to teach media and war that you have to go back to World War I. Juan Gonzalez talked about it a little bit in his panel. We learned how to demonize the enemy, create a world of us and them. The social psychology of war was created for a mass population to win support. Then Bush has called Osama bin Laden the evil one, if you remember back there when it was us and them. It's right out of Harold Laswell's propaganda. You've kind of got to understand this. But as the century progresses, with the technology and with what used to be called propaganda, fairly dramatic World War I, now we have information management. Information management was just escalated throughout the entire century. It's really telling about war to go back to even World War II, because we were the ones who let off the atomic bomb, but we never came to terms with what it did to this country to fight that battle, to have air raids on all the major Axis powers. And what happened in the post-World War II period is the merger of the media and the military-industrial complex and the expansion of the military-industrial complex without any discussion in the mainstream about peace and what a peace and justice society would look like. In the middle of that decade after World War I, World War II, we had Korea. And on MASH, Hawkeye drinks because he says we drink to forget. And it's the forgotten war, but we did in Korea what we would later do in Vietnam. We dropped napalm, almost as much napalm as we did on Vietnam. And we lost 32,000 soldiers in Korea, but we don't remember that. And documentaries that have been tried to be made and put on PBS about Korea in the 1980s under Reagan's new Cold War were censored so that the American public would never really know the history of Korea. Then we move on to Vietnam, and what we have now is the total rewriting of the Vietnam War about how protest made us lose the war, and protest was bad for this country, and protest, as we all know, was the best thing that happened to this country during the Vietnam War. Also, we had the uncensored war in Vietnam, where journalists actually went on the ground, they took pictures, and at times in the chronology, like the pictures that Mark took in Fallujah. The difference is in Vietnam that they came to light as the war was being fought, because the Tet Offensive pushed those pictures into the public frame, and people recoiled from the images of suffering of soldiers and civilian sufferings in Vietnam. And since that time, information management has been the military designing ways to get to where we arrived at with the Iraq War, which is embeddedness, by restricting them from battlefield access, making a compliant press over the course of a century, knowing full well that they'll never get access, which is what they define themselves as journalists, to get access to the field unless they go along with the war. So all of that build-up to the war in Iraq was huge PR for the Pentagon, because they were going to let, for the first time, the journalists come in and tell you what the war really looked like. And the minute the war looked real, they took it off the air, of course. I also go back to Iran-Contra. We need impeachment hearings because people need to come up and talk about what happened, because all of the history of media mismanagement during Iran-Contra was buried as a consequence of the hearings, and it never came to light. So George H.W. Bush said in his diary, Iran-Contra secret has been kept. I hope it never comes to light, and he pardoned Caspar Weinberger. We have to know this history, or we're going to keep on living war in this country over and over again. Fair is going to do an excerpt of my book, which is going to be, which is the the Grenadian invasion, which I think was the first preemptive strike. When Ronald Reagan died, did we all say, "You saved us from those 110 inhabitants of the island of Grenada, and they were a threat, and they were going to really get us"? Right? Nobody remembered that about Ronald Reagan, because it was a successful preemptive strike, and they dominated the island, and they got out of there before it could turn into a quagmire like it turned into Vietnam. So we get to Iraq, and what do we have? We have, over the entire course of the century, something that's come up a lot here, and it really hasn't been talked about much, but that is the economic merger between the media and the military, with the key high-tech, computer-based technologies that run the weapons of mass destruction are the very same technologies that are the components of video games. And the research and development on the part of the military and the private sector, media, entertainment network, in the entertainment military complex, over the course of the 90s, merged their economies of visual sensibility so that when we literally play video games, we are also training our children in the house to be recruited and be trained in these kinds of technologies, and we celebrate them on the news, and that same visual is in movies, and it is all the same visual imaging that is in the weapon system. So I ask you, I don't think when we move to some pure war, endless war, because our economies and our visual landscape and our audiovisual culture revolves around planning for, thinking about, entertaining ourselves with war, we have got a sense of permanent war at this point, and we really need to put the brakes on that. And I think the media should be divested from the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Thank you.